Hello and welcome to a new video. As you watch this thrilling, unedited TF2 gameplay, I'm going to be talking about the Activision and Blizzard and King and Microsoft merger and Sony's response to it. Things are definitely popping up in the objectively worst entertainment industry from a consumer perspective, as Phil Spencer's little shopping spree continues following the ZeniMax purchase with Blizzard, Activision, and King. Now what's interesting about this is Microsoft's main interest in this purchase is actually King, which is a mobile gaming company responsible for the Candy Crush game. It's Microsoft wanting to step foot into the realm of mobile gaming, and King is just the vessel in order to do so. So even though Microsoft probably sees this more as a begrudging bundle to deal with when getting a specific company, Sony is chimping out over a different part of the package, Activision, and more specifically than Activision, Call of Duty. My own opinion on all of this is just as a rule of thumb, I don't like the idea of a company as large as Microsoft getting that much larger by just swallowing up smaller companies. However, despite this immediate opinion, I really don't see what leg Sony has to stand on in regards to the merger, and the way Sony has conducted itself and the arguments it's made have been funny to say the least. Despite what Xbox fans might want to argue, between Microsoft and Sony, Sony is almost unquestioningly the dominant company in gaming. Their console has more sales worldwide than the Series X or S. Their games are more iconic, more people know about God of War and The Last of Us, and they've overall been having better years recently in the market. What was 2022 standout Sony title? God of War Ragnarok. What was Microsoft's? Scorn maybe? And even when applying their video game IPs to other ventures, Sony still reigns supreme. The Last of Us is almost universally praised by critics and fans of The Last of Us. Meanwhile, Microsoft's foray into television with the Halo TV series, Halo fans were not happy, critics weren't particularly happy. It was another major L for Microsoft. I almost wonder if one of the reasons Microsoft even wants to purchase King and get into the mobile market is because they've been having such trouble with the console market. They obviously are still interested in the console market. You can't play Bethesda's Starfield on your phone, but I think they want that kind of backup, assured mobile gaming whale money if it's another rainy day in the console department. What I find interesting is that Sony has been pretty silent as far as I can tell when Microsoft bought ZeniMax. Maybe because Bethesda games are fewer and far between, whereas Call of Duty is a yearly installment, so the monetary impact of losing COD is that much more evident. In any case, Sony has argued in court filings the sheer magnitude of importance of Call of Duty, and it's actually pretty fucking funny seeing this multi-billion-dollar company basically say, we suck, we can't make games that sell, God of War, The Last of Us, Spider-Man literally only exist because of Call of Duty dollars. As if losing Call of Duty, they might as well seize the production of any more PlayStation 5s, cause that shit ain't gonna sell anymore. It must be real interesting to be a God of War developer, for example, and knowing that your parent company thinks so little of your product that they don't think it's a console seller. Now, granted, the majority of sales on consoles are from multi-platform third-party stuff, so Sony isn't entirely wrong, but what I would ask Sony, or Sony's executive, or Jim Ryan, or whatever, is, let's say I have the power to dictate the whole merger, and I'm going to make a deal with you that the merger will not happen. Call of Duty will still be an independent third-party game, but you have to give Microsoft God of War and The Last of Us and Spider-Man. Would you do it? Or, because if Call of Duty is a make-it-or-break-it title, then surely you should be able to give up these other titles and still reap in the monetary benefits of COD. Now, it's very unlikely they would want to take such a deal because those titles are major parts of the PlayStation brand. But because Sony has been jerking off Call of Duty so much, it is a question that could legitimately be asked and contemplated. Being a globalized society, it means that not just one country can make the call and approve of this merger, but multiple different countries like Japan and Brazil and the UK also have to approve of it. Now, so far, every country that's made a decision has ruled in favor of Microsoft. But one of the funny things that Sony did when petitioning to these regulators is the big three in gaming are Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo. But Nintendo is a bit problematic for Sony, because then the obvious question is, well, hold on a second, Nintendo doesn't even have Call of Duty, and that's actually Sony's fault, amusingly. And yet they're still able to financially thrive, and financially thrive with their own IPs. Why is Mario and Link and Kirby and Pokemon able to carry Nintendo, but Kratos and Abby and Spider-Man not able to carry Sony? So, in an attempt to avoid this difficult discussion, Sony has campaigned to say that actually we're talking about quote-unquote high-end systems, which would be the Series X and maybe a Series S and the PlayStation 5. The Switch isn't a high-end system, we don't need to talk about that. And to Sony's credit, Nintendo has consistently been behind in terms of hardware power for like the last few generations, but it is still a fairly arbitrary distinction. Nintendo is a console maker. They're a major part of the gaming industry. They make games that aren't playable on a phone. Some regulatory bodies were willing to accept this distinction, while others were saying, no, Nintendo counts. But the ones that did accept it were left with a very funny insight or revelation with the fact that throughout the European Union, Sony dominates. In Japan, Sony dominates. The only place that Microsoft has any real standing is in the United States, and even then, a lot of individual states are riding with Sony and not Microsoft. After the dust has settled and the ashes cleared of Nintendo's unceremonial extinction in the matter of discussion, what we're left with is a scenario where Sony looks so dominating, it's almost unfair not to let Microsoft own Call of Duty. The PlayStation can't continue to exist without Call of Duty. Even with Call of Duty, the Xbox Series X barely exists in homes and markets. Hell, like when these consoles first came out and you had all these dickhead scalpers, it was a PlayStation 5 that was consistently the topic of conversation in relation to scalping. Almost no one really gave a shit about the availability of the Series X. In response to the problem of exclusivity, Microsoft has played its cards fairly well. They've made deals with multiple other companies in regards to COD being on their console, saying, how about for the next 10 years, we'll port COD to your console or your platform if you want it. We'll port COD to the Nintendo Switch, so Nintendo's fine with the merger. We'll port COD to Steam, so Valve is fine with the merger. I think they also made like a deal with Nvidia, or one of the graphics cards companies. Oh, and if you're wondering what's going on here, occasionally the server would just say, oh, nope, too much gaming, we're gonna put you on pause for a few seconds. And of course, Microsoft has extended this offer to Sony as well. In fact, there's even a video of like the CEO or some higher up in Microsoft basically waving a set of papers for a Sony executive to sign to seal the deal, saying, it's been open, it is open, it will be open, all you have to do is sign it. Now, 10 years in the gaming industry is a long time. It's an entire console generation, time for the old one to finally finish and the new one to be made. So the idea is that if Microsoft, after that 10 years, pulls the plug on availability from these other companies, by that point they would have been able to make and establish their own direct Call of Duty competitor. And Sony does have a few FPS IPs in its bag. I mean, they could revive the Resistance IP if they wanted, or the Killzone IP. Oh, and I taunt Dead Ringer Spy, so that's why I did that. It actually kind of seems like Sony is the only one who needs a direct competitor. Nintendo has its COD competitor, Splatoon, a first-person shooter kind of game, but with its own unique, family-friendly Nintendo twist. And Valve has TF2, which I'm playing right now, and CSGO, both immensely successful FPS games that, granted, are different in nature than Call of Duty, but still scratch that FPS itch. As Sony points out in their filings, they need Call of Duty money in order to make their own games. The problem is, their own games are mostly what people label as movie games. They're not made for fast-paced high action, they're more vessels for a story. In many ways, it's almost like Sony is throwing a little temper tantrum because they're not going to be able to do whatever they want in regards to gaming anymore. And you can see right there an example of the game just saying, nope, you're done gaming. What do you mean we have to stop making grumpy third-person, over-the-shoulder dad simulators where you walk through a forest and the main form of combat is archery? That's our brand, dude, and we need COD in order to sustain it. Actually, what's funny is if this merger does go through due to the purchase of ZeniMax, that means Microsoft has Halo, it has Doom, it has Wolfenstein, it has Quake, and now it has COD. Microsoft would hold a pretty fat stack of iconic FPS games under its belt if the merger goes through. So the question then becomes, well, why doesn't Sony just bite the bullet, sign the contract, get Call of Duty for the next 10 years, and they could continue to negotiate. When the, contract is up, they could try to negotiate an extension or another 10 years. Like, it's completely on the fucking table that Microsoft would continue to put Call of Duty on the PlayStation, since it's basically like a revenue generator for themselves by proxy. Well, Sony has presented quite a few arguments as to why they don't want the deal to happen beyond just potentially losing Call of Duty outright. One of the most fucking ironic arguments they've made, after the fact they've made it, is that they're worried that Microsoft would release an intentionally scuffed version, a scuffed port of Call of Duty on the PlayStation to incentivize people from having a PlayStation and getting an Xbox to play COD properly. Now, after the fact, there's a recent The Last of Us Part 1 port to Steam, which was received overwhelmingly negatively because it was an absolutely scuffed dog shit port of the game. Sony hired a studio or something that's even notorious for bad ports. So rather than going out of their way to ensure that The Last of Us plays as well on as many different PC builds as possible, it plays horribly even on great builds. So that's real fucking ironic that Sony's crying about the possibility of a scuffed port when they've done that after making the argument. But even after Sony bought Bungie and there was a first Destiny DLC that was made by Sony's Bungie, there was a weird fucking glitch where Xbox players weren't even able to log on to their accounts and play the game. So again, Sony's crying about something that they're likely guilty of intentionally. Hell, that may be one of the main reasons why quite a few people, even if they don't particularly like Xbox or Call of Duty or anything like that, are hoping that the merger happens and Microsoft buttfucks Sony as a result. Like maybe Microsoft saying, we feel that Activision should get a little bit more of the cut. We don't want to take anything from the store it's sold in, so maybe you should get less money for each purchase. I think that's just fair. I went out and used the restroom and I realized I completely fucking forgot about Horizon Zero Dawn, which evidently gamers in general also have, considering that when the first game released, it was up against Breath of the Wild and got fucking stomped, and then the sequel comes out and it's up against Elden Ring and also got stomped. And Sony really wanted Aloy to be kind of a flagship character for their console as well. In, I think it was Italy, they even had this shitty plaster statue of her with the name The Placeholder. And the placeholder isn't literally a placeholder plaque that they forgot to put an actual name on. That's what she was called, and it was some generic bullshit about her being a champion for women's rights or whatever. Some stupid shit like that. Actually, Sony is so fucking desperate for Call of Duty that they even began sucking COD players' dicks by having in rulings calling them sophisticated, intelligent, crowing about how smart Call of Duty players are. And I'm pretty sure even if you fucking like Call of Duty, even if you're a big COD guy, you're probably aware that the stereotype for you and people like you isn't that they're a bunch of brainiacs. In fact, they're usually depicted as being these kind of frat house dude bros, so to say. Whoever wrote that, I hope was cringing the entire time and was fully aware of just how fucking desperate they sound. But I guess they are desperate because they really need that Call of Duty, and the notion of Microsoft owns Call of Duty but they're still gonna get a port isn't good enough for them. Another one of Sony's worries is that Microsoft will somehow prevent any crossplay, between PC gamers, Xbox gamers, and PlayStation gamers, which again is kind of hypocritical because Sony was against crossplay very early on and only kind of begrudgingly started allowing crossplay with the other players. Yeah, overall, it's just been like a total shit show for Sony as hypocrisy and goofiness and just plain old corporate stupidity have come to light over them chipping out about fucking COD of all things. One thing I wonder is, like, how are the Blizzard devs feeling about all this? Like, Microsoft really cares mostly about King. COD may have been like a fucking afterthought for all we know, but Microsoft wants King to get those mobile gamers under their umbrella. And Sony is, of course, chimping out about COD, so it's Activision they really care about. Nobody seems to really give a shit about Blizzard. I mean, I guess if you're a Blizzard dev, you probably by now should be resigned to know your place. Like, anyone who worked on Overwatch 2, if you didn't expect that your game just exists as a vessel for SFM porn, you're looking at the picture all wrong. You know, all of this really must look worse for developers for Sony Studios and Microsoft Studios, given like what Microsoft's intentions are. If Microsoft really does just want to get into the mobile gaming scene and they have to buy these other studios as part of the package, then that's going to sting way less for someone working on Halo than it is for someone working on God of War, seeing the company they work for just like going ballistic. I wonder if Sony is going to get so desperate they end up porting Bloodborne to the PC, which is something people have been asking for like a fucking decade at this point, but just never happened. For me, it's like the one Soulsborne game that I'm even remotely interested in playing due to its gothic and Lovecraftian setting. I don't particularly care for the settings of Elden Ring or the Dark Souls games and their medieval fantasy look, so that would be nice, but it's Sony we're talking about. They are a desperate, or not desperate, but stubborn. Well, they are desperate, but they are also very stubborn. A stubborn mule of a company. Just thinking back to the Last of Us port is especially funny considering that like other ports of Sony games have gone on pretty well. Like there's not this criticism of Spider-Man on Steam or God of War on PC. Is God of War on PC? It probably is. Or Horizon Zero Dawn. And The Last of Us might be their current really big flagship IP due to the success of the TV show. So like you would think they would want a really good port so they can get even more big Last of Us fans and capitalize off of The Last of Us 2 being ported over and them wanting to see the TV show of that really cool game they played, and they completely fucked it up as they were whining about the possibility of Microsoft making intentionally bad ports. Like, the timing couldn't be more perfect, and it wouldn't surprise me if some people who still haven't approved of this merger have caught wind of this whole, problem of The Last of Us. As far as I can tell, it seems very likely that this merger will be approved by any regulators who haven't already given it the green light. As said before, Sony is the dominating force in gaming between it and Microsoft, and with Nintendo out of the picture, the monopoly that Sony has been arguing the merger would make Microsoft seems all the worse. Now, Microsoft can't force people to love Xbox, and a big problem for Microsoft is all of these purchases were made by the volition of gamers. In a free market that's supposed to exist, sucks to suck. People have chosen PlayStation, and whether or not Call of Duty is going to be there may be irrelevant to many. But at the same time, given just how overwhelmingly dominating Sony is, some competition in the quote-unquote high-end console gaming would definitely be welcomed. Another funny thing I just realized is like the problem for Microsoft when it comes to gaming related media outside of consoles is even bigger now, because The Last of Us TV series is extremely well received. And now you have the Super Mario Bros. Movie, which, even though critics didn't like it, was the highest grossing opening for an animated movie ever. Now, I don't think anyone who isn't a complete fucking moron didn't assume this movie wouldn't do great. Like, everyone who knows anything were anticipating it making numbers, but being the highest grossing of all time for its opening, Microsoft should probably be hoping that the upcoming Fallout TV series ends up being good. And maybe it will be, maybe it won't be, but given, how well things have been going with Bethesda and quality lately, it wouldn't surprise me if it ends up sucking too. So what Microsoft needs to do is, even though it's a third-party game, they need to commission a Scorn anime that'll bring in the numbers and praises. And it has to be an anime, cause even though the product it's based on could be complete dog shit, if there's an anime adaptation of it, then a bunch of fucking weebs are going to cope hard and praise it. Like Cyberpunk 2077 didn't start getting real praise until the fucking anime came out and a bunch of desperate weebs wanting to fuck the cyborg lolly started talking about how fantastic the game is. So at this point, I'm just kind of rambling on about completely unrelated stuff, so I'll just end it with a summary of this has been a rather amusing display of corporate incompetence and Sony freaking out when they realize that they may not be able to play Soldier anymore with Call of Duty titles, even though Microsoft is pointing at their toy box saying, look, I'll share with you, you can play for the next 10 hours, but then, I want to play just by myself. Given Sony's dominance in the video game industry compared to Microsoft, both in terms of sales and reputation, I really don't see regulatory bodies being all that concerned about Microsoft owning these companies. The merger is probably gonna go through. Whether or not Sony's willing to sign a contract, if the merger goes through, Sony's gonna be banging on Microsoft's door saying, let me sign. So I think that's inevitable as well. Anyways, just thought I'd talk about another fun moment in the industry that we all know and don't particularly like anymore, but still partake in. I hope you enjoyed the video, that gave you something to think about and otherwise entertained you. Take care.